In this lesson, we'll start the third of our triumvirate of applications. We started with the appropriately named first app, and in the last lesson, we completed the demonstration application, or demo app. And in this lesson, we'll start the sample application, or sample app, that we'll be using throughout the rest of the tutorial. Now, the demo app from the last lesson was essentially my version of the famous 15-minute Rails blog engine, and it's effectively a toy application. The difference between that toy application and a real industrial strength application is the difference between the last lesson and the rest of the tutorial. There are 10 more lessons corresponding to the 10 chapters from chapters 3 through 12 in the Ruby on Rails tutorial book. So it takes quite a bit of time and effort to learn how to write a real Rails web application, but that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to start with something I call mostly static pages, and it's a very simple exercise, but it's incredibly rich and instructive. So let's get going on that. As before, with the first app and the demo app, we're going to run the Rails script to create a new application. So let's change into the Rails projects directory and run Rails new, and then the name of the application, in this case, sample app. Now, previously we hit return at this point, but we're not quite done in this case. And the reason is because we're actually going to be writing tests for the sample app. And by default, Rails uses a testing framework called test unit. And test unit is perfectly fine, but I prefer to use RSpec. So we're going to want to suppress the creation of the default testing. And in this case, we can do that by passing the $T flag. Essentially what this does is it keeps Rails from creating a test directory. So if we hit return here, all of the application skeleton is the same as for the first app and the demo app, except there's no test directory. Now let's cd into our sample app directory. And as usual, the first step is to configure our system with the right gems. Now previously, all we've done is change the SQLite 3 Ruby version to one that works on my system. You might not have to do this, as I've mentioned before. But in this case, we're going to make a couple more changes. So let's get rid of all this stuff, so we can have a clean file. Actually, we can use this stuff down here. Let's get rid of this. Oops. There is an example here that's useful. So you can see from this section here that it's possible to have a group. In this case, it says to install this gem called WebRat for development and test. So we're going to change this. We're just going to say in development, we need the RSpec Rails gem. Now, RSpec Rails, you would think would have to run in the test environment, but in fact, it has to run in the development environment. It might work in either case, but this will certainly work. This is according to the instructions by Dave Cholemsky, who's the lead developer for RSpec. And we do want to use a specific version, which is 2.0.0. And now, right now, RSpec 2 is in beta, and I'm going to use beta 18. 19 is actually out as of this moment, but it breaks something called integration testing that we'll be talking about later. And so this gem version will work. You should check the online version of the Ruby on Rails tutorial book to see what the latest version supported by the tutorial is. And the other thing we want to do is make a group for test and actually install the RSpec gem. And that's the same version. So we can just close down the gem file, and as before, do bundle install to install the gems needed by our project. Okay, bundler is done installing our gems, and in the past, at this point, we've configured the .gitignore file and then committed to Git right away. But in this case, I want to add some files first that are associated specifically with RSpec. The way we do that is with Rails generate RSpec:install. This created a .rspec configuration file, the spec directory, and some other tests or some other files that we need to run RSpec. And at this point, we're ready to do the .gitignore file step. And this is the default one, and as usual, I'm going to use the augmented one from the Ruby on Rails tutorial website. There we go. Now we can do git init, git add dot, and git commit -am. We don't need this. I often put the A in, even when I don't need it. Initial commit, and now let's create a GitHub repository for it. All right, let's create a new repository. In this case, I'm going to put in a URL. Oops. I'll just use the main Rails tutorial website and create the repository. There we go. As before, we've already done the global setup, and we need to do this configuration step. And then git push origin master. This will fail for me as before, but it'll probably just work for you. Add myself as a collaborator. And we should be good to go. Just up arrow. Take a look at the sample app. And there we go. And as before, the stupid README keeps coming back. So let's change that README. We see that it worked. There's the new README. Even at this early stage, I want to deploy to Heroku, just so we have the option of committing to GitHub or pushing to GitHub and deploying the application to Heroku regularly. So let's do Heroku create. Now we can do git push Heroku master. And now we're ready to move on to truly static pages, and then we'll make some minor modifications to turn them into mostly static pages, or as you may perhaps prefer to think of it, slightly dynamic pages. We'll start by opening up the project in TextMate. You should use your favorite editor or IDE. Rails has two separate ways to handle truly static pages, and one is perhaps a little bit more static than the other. And we'll be looking at both of them. Let's start with the first, which is sort of an old school way of just serving a static HTML file out of what's called the public directory. So let's take a look at public. So you can see there are several HTML files. See if you can guess which one is the default Rails page. Let's take a look at it. Of course, we should have known that was going to happen. We're not actually running a server locally, so let's open up a new tab here. Now it should work. There we go. This is the local default page that we've seen several times before. Now, you may remember that the default page served out by web applications, or any sort of website, is the index page. So let's go back to our directory structure. You can see that there is, in fact, a file called public index.html. And if you look at this, the title is somewhat auspicious. Ruby on Rails Welcome Aboard, which in fact is the title up here of the default page. So this is the source that gets served up as the default Ruby on Rails page. Now, don't look too closely at this. It's really quite ugly. There's inline cascading style sheets here. There's some inline JavaScript. It's really quite a mess. But it's not designed to be beautiful. It's designed to be just a single default page, which you almost always remove in short order. And we'll be removing it in short order as well. But it does give us a good glimpse at the structure of an HTML document. And so we're going to learn how to create our first static page by creating our own static HTML page in the public directory. So let's follow computer science practice and have it be a greeting of some kind. This is going to be hello.html. Now, if you look at the structure of this document from the top, you'll notice the first line is this doc type. So what is this? This is always the first line in an HTML document. And what it does is it identifies the version of HTML that this document uses. Now, this doc type is very simple by historical standards, and it represents the latest HTML standard, which is HTML5. The use of HTML5 by default is new in Rails 3. So let's take a look at hello.html. You can actually see what the doc types used to be like. If you do doc type tab in TextMate, it gives you some of the old doc types. You can do something like this, and you can see it's really quite complicated. But the doc type for HTML5 is just this, very simple. And now we can look at the next thing, which is this opening HTML tag. It just identifies it as an HTML document. So I'm going to create them both. Let's create the opening and closing tag at the same time. So that's our HTML tag. And then we've got the head of the document. You can see there's a title. Every document should have a title. And I'm going to call this a greeting. And then every document also has a body. See here the body. Here's the body down here. It's a bunch of stuff. In this case, we're just going to make something really simple. We're just going to have the standard greeting in the world of computers, which is a paragraph, in this case, that says, hello world. Now, if this is the index page by default, you actually might be able to guess that if you type index.html, that it will be the same thing. It'll just serve out the HTML file. In fact, you can even leave off the HTML. That'll still work. So let's see if you can guess how to get that hello page. It's hello.html. And there it is, hello world. So this is the only time that we're ever going to create a static HTML file of this sort. But this is a nice stepping stone to the next more sophisticated way of creating static HTML files. Since we won't actually need this file ever again, we're just going to get rid of it. So let's go back to here. I'm just going to remove it. This is public hello. Yes, I want to get rid of it. And now we're ready for the next step. The second way to create static pages in Rails is to use the full Rails stack, as it's sometimes called. This is essentially the model view controller pattern that we saw in the last lesson. So Rails is able to serve static views as well as dynamic views. They're essentially the same process. In this case, we're not going to be hitting the model layer, but we will be using the view and controller parts of MVC. So let's take a look at how that works. Since we're thinking of this as a real application, this sample app, we're going to follow a common practice on the web, which is to have some static pages associated with our application. In this case, we're going to have a home page, a contact page, and an about page. So let's see how to create those. Because we're going to have several static pages, I want to have a controller that will have actions for those pages, one action per page. So I'm going to generate a controller called pages. Now, at this point, you can actually include the actions that you want at the command line. With something like users or microposts, as we saw in the case of the demo app when we generated a scaffold, there was a default set of actions associated with each of those resources corresponding to the standard REST actions in a Rails application. But the Pages controller is not RESTful. It does not follow the REST pattern. And that's fine. Sometimes people get hung up on making everything RESTful in a Rails application. But in this case, having a small number of static pages is not the kind of thing that REST is good for. So we're going to create a home action and a contact action here at the command line. And I'm going to intentionally forget the about action so that we can see how to do it by hand. And then it will also provide a motivation for automated testing later on in this lesson. All right, let's take a look at the results of that. Let's navigate to App, Controllers, Pages Controller. And you can see here that there are two actions defined by default. So I'm just going to change things around. I like this formatting better. But you can see how this works. It's just a Pages controller with a home and contact action. Let's take another look at the MVC diagram from the last lesson, just to remind ourselves how this works. So in this case, we're not going to go to /users, but we are going to have a URL that's going to hit the Rails router, and it will be routed to an action in the Pages controller. It won't hit the model, but it will render a view back to the browser. So let's take a look at the routes file that we saw in the last lesson. So in config routes, now remember what we had before. We had something that said resources users and resources microposts. And those gave us a whole bunch of default actions corresponding to the REST conventions. In this case, though, we simply have two lines. We have get pages home and get pages contact. And remember that if you just hit a page with a normal request from a browser, if you just click on a link, it's a GET request. So what this says is if this application gets hit with the GET request for pages/home, it should get routed to the home action. And similarly for get pages contact. So let's take a look at that in the browser. We go to localhost :3000 /pages/home. And there we go. This is the home page. And in addition to having a top-level heading here, it also has a helpful hint. It says, find me in app views pages home.html.drb. So let's go take a look at that. So we're in app views pages home.html.drb. And here's the HTML file corresponding to that web page. It's got an H1, a top-level heading, and then a paragraph with the hint about where to find it. And as you can probably guess, the contact page is the same, essentially. It's the same thing here. Now, you may have noticed that the actions here in the Pages controller are simply empty. They don't do anything right now. And in fact, we can get rid of them. Let's just get rid of the home page here, or the home action, rather. And you'll see that Rails will still work. There's an implicit action corresponding to this view, even though the action isn't defined in the controller. But I find that it's more useful to actually identify the controller or the actions explicitly in the controller. I like to be able to see at a glance which actions are defined inside the controller. So I'll be following that practice throughout this tutorial. At this point, we're done with this first controller. So let's commit it. See where we are. Git status. I'm going to git add dot, and then git commit with a message added a pages controller.